featuring Forrester Research. My name is Paul Reif, and I'm a director here at Marble Security. We would like to thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details. This presentation will run approximately 40 to 45 minutes. We will then have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. A recording of this webinar will be made available on Marble's website. If you have any questions or technical issues during the webinar, please type the question in the toolbar section on the right-hand side of your screen. With me today is Dave Jevons, Marble Security's founder, chairman, and chief technology officer. Dave also currently serves as the chairman of the Anti-Phishing Working Group, a consortium of more than 1,500 financial services companies, ISPs, law enforcement agencies, and technology vendors dedicated to fighting crimeware, email fraud, and online identity theft. We are also privileged to have as our featured guest here today, Tyler Shields. Tyler is a senior analyst with Forrester Research and is a leading expert on mobile and application security. He has researched a diverse set of topics, including creating a BYOD policy, the mobile security stack, the impact of mobile malware on privacy, reverse engineering of binary applications, toolkits, rootkits, anti-debugging technologies, and, most recently, a programmatic approach to securing your mobile application ecosystem. As a quick reminder, please feel free to ask questions throughout this webinar by typing your question in the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. With that, let's get started by asking Tyler for a few opening remarks on market trends.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I don't have any slides for this part. I just wanted to take a minute or two and let the audience hear a little bit about where I see the trends in the market taking us and where I see the future of mobile security, cloud security, and application security going, and how it might affect change in the IT enterprise today. Cloud is really drastically changing the way we work, and it's doing it very quickly. Specifically, it's doing it around what I call the speed of cloud. It's increasing our ability to collaborate, especially remotely. It's increasing the pace of innovation. Cloud and mobile are allowing employees to execute on vision in a much faster time frame. And creativity is really being fostered, data sharing increasing significantly at a very rapid rate. And all of these traits have very positive impacts on the way we do business today. What used to be a single enterprise transaction perimeter is really morphing into a security perimeter that really comes down to the data and the individual device. So much so that cloud, mobile, the Internet of Things is really pushing security into completely new realms. So, it's time to really rethink how we execute enterprise security. We need to rethink enterprise security to look at it from a feature offering and differentiation standpoint for all the vendors, and we need to have the enterprises look at security in a way that looks from the data outward and can take a risk-based analytical approach at securing the mobile space, the application space, and the cloud space, and really kind of understanding what that would look like from a security perspective and applying the appropriate security measures based on risk quantification metrics that are real and valid. I see BYOD really pushing IT to make a lot of changes and become much more proactive in their focus of security today. So with that, I'll kick it back to Paul, and we can actually just begin the Q&A.
Thank you for those insightful remarks, Tyler. Let's go ahead and move on to our first question today. What is the new mobile threat environment, and what type of threats in particular are you currently seeing to security in the enterprise? Dave, let's go ahead and have you take this first question.
Well, thank you, Paul, and hello to all our listeners today. I just got back from the APWG eCrime Summit, which was the 10th anniversary of this conference, and it's interesting to see how things have changed and are changing and what the threat vectors are, particularly on the mobile side of things. What I'm starting to see is a much more dynamic threat environment that is changing quickly, where cyber criminals, hostile governments, and insiders are learning from what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years of attacks which have primarily been against the Windows operating system, and they're starting to target that type of attack against mobile devices because that's where the users are. That's what the users are using on a day-to-day basis. They're on their phones, they're on their iPads, they're on their Androids, and the trend is just so heavily in favor of adoption of those platforms that we're starting to see more and more innovation by bad guys on those platforms. Now, the attacks that we're seeing on the mobile side are to some extent quite different than what we have traditionally seen and continue to see on the laptop and the PC side of things. One of the things that we're seeing is the rise of not just rootkits and things of that nature, but more malicious applications. These tend to be apps where somebody has taken, for example, a paid and very popular game, like maybe a version of Angry Birds. They've taken a copy of it and they have injected malicious code into it and republished the app on one of over 100 different app stores and app marketplaces that we're monitoring. So that is a very common type of attack that we're seeing. It's particularly of concern to folks who are allowing bring your own device type environments where your employees might connect to either your network or cloud services that you're offering them off their own device, because you just don't know what's on that device. We've seen a new type of attack, which we will be publishing some work on shortly, which we call hostile profile and device takeover attacks. These are attacks that work on the iOS environment, so they work on iPhones and iPads, as well as on Android devices, and they allow attackers to fool users into effectively doing as few as 2 clicks to have their entire device taken over, or to have certain apps on the device replaced by hostile apps. It's a particularly concerning new type of attack, and we're starting to see it pop up in the wild. We're also seeing the rise of malicious networks, because people on mobile devices are connecting to 5 or 10 or more different networks every month, whether it's the coffee shop or the airport or the hotel. And those attacks can be evil twin attacks, so people stand up a Starbucks fast network and people connect to it, and now they're man-in-the-middling all the traffic. Or we're seeing DNS poisoning attacks either at the Wi-Fi or downstream at the ISP. And we're seeing a variety of cross-site scripting attacks and cookie sidejacking attacks where unencrypted traffic is getting sidejacked and people are getting into your users' personal accounts. And from getting into their personal account, there are many ways to attack the enterprise. And finally, spear phishing is dramatically on the rise. It is very, very clever. It is targeting mobile users either through SMS or through email. And we're seeing, as few as 1, 2, 3, or 4 users in an enterprise be targeted. And they're much more vulnerable on a mobile device because 1, they're checking their email all the time or their SMS. 2, they're connected to multiple email systems like their personal email and their work email off that device. And 3, that device doesn't have a very big screen real estate, so a lot of the security that we are used to on a larger screen or on a Windows-based operating system isn't available. So that's some of the threats that we're seeing in the mobile environment.
Thank you, Dave. Let's go ahead and move on to question number 2. Threats to enterprise mobile security are morphing daily. How is mobile security evolving to protect against these dynamic threats? This is a great question. Tyler, could you go ahead and share your thoughts on this continuously evolving topic with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that threats to the enterprise mobile space are changing daily. The interesting thing is we have some history in the PC space that we can kind of look at and see what that path might look like, going from network-based targeted attacks to moving upward in the stack up into the application and data layer. And what we're seeing is that it's following a similar trajectory to what the PC space did over the last couple of decades. It's just following that trajectory in a much more rapid pace. So what I mean by that is if we look at the security stack of mobile, and we start at the bottom tier and we see the carrier, carrier networks, above that being the firmware of the device, the hardware of the device, above that being the operating system, and above that being the application layer, we are seeing that the trend is being moving up the stack, because the higher you get in that stack, the more effective your attacks are. And that's the same path that the PC space followed originally. When people were targeting network devices through the firewall, people moved up into the operating system attacks, and then people realized, hey, I can make quick compromises and quick money by actually attacking at the application layer and sending out Trojans, viruses, spam, etc. We're seeing a similar path in the PC space. It's just getting there in a more rapid pace. It's not going to take 15 years for the attackers to figure that out. They've been there and they've done that. But from a security perspective, we've been there as well. So we're able to morph a little bit more quickly and predict the trends and the future patterns of the attackers and where they might be going. And we can actually anticipate where the attackers might be going over time and target our security paradigms, our security products and offerings to fix those areas where we perceive that they will be going. Now, I perceive that attackers are going to continue to move into the application space. If we consider the fact that mobile applications and mobility in general is expected to outpace laptop and desktop usage in the enterprise within the next few years, it's only a matter of time before attackers come over to the mobile side and start targeting at that application layer in mass quantities. Between now and then, we'll see a lot more targeted attacks and specific attacks that are more of the specifically targeting an individual person or an enterprise and trying to get into the person's mobile device in that manner. And then eventually we'll start to see the mass attacks again over time. From a security perspective, we have to secure at all those layers, but we have to make sure that we're secure at the layers that the targets are going to over time.
Dave, did you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. I think Tyler's absolutely right that we can learn a lot about the trajectory. So while the criminals are moving much faster than they were, we also as an industry have learned a lot, and we're moving much more quickly. And Tyler's absolutely right that these attacks are moving up the stack, meaning not just on the mobile trying to put a rootkit and break into the operating system, but much more around these fake applications and targeted attacks in that area. My view on this is that the security industry is responding, but we've also got another challenge, which is the rise of bring your own device programs. So people using their own Android or iPhone or iPad to connect into not only corporate sites, but cloud sites, and being able to know, for example, what apps are on a user's device, what they do, what their behaviors are, and have they changed, and are they exposing the user or the enterprise to data loss or credential loss is an interesting area where the industry is really starting to put a lot of focus.
Thank you, Tyler and Dave. Our next question asks, with the millions of apps now available, do you think that blacklisting of malicious apps, data leaking apps, and data sharing apps is truly viable? Dave, we'll let you take a swing at this question first, and then we'll ask Tyler to share his viewpoint as well.
So my view on this is that a whitelisting approach can work, meaning if you've bought the user a device, you provision the 20 apps that you want on that device, and then you lock it all down, I think that can work. But that does not appear to be the trend that we're seeing in the enterprise. The trend is more to allow either more open devices where people can add new apps, or to let people in with their own devices, in which case you don't know what app is on it. Now, a blacklisting approach, in my view, is a risky approach, and it's a lot of work. because there are millions of apps. There's new ones all the time. They're changing all the time. People are spoofing apps and posting them on different sites. There are new ways to get them, side-loading attacks, etc. So my view is that if you were to take a blacklisting approach, was, for example, these 50 apps or these 100 apps are not allowed, that's fine, but you're going to miss the other 500,000 apps that might expose corporate data to loss to third-party websites. And if you wanted to purely rely on a blacklisting technology as opposed to combining it with a app analysis technology, you would be editing your blacklist every hour. To me, it's akin to virus scanning. Tyler, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, you're spot on, Dave. The blacklisting solution is just not a scalable, extensible solution. It's a default open paradigm when you're using blacklisting, and I do not recommend blacklisting in the long term. Now, if that's all you've got, it's certainly better than zero. Go ahead and blacklist. The better option is indeed to whitelist your applications and to create a programmatic approach to securing those applications. So I'm not talking necessarily about having 5 security engineers at the ready, able to grab the applications that their users are requesting and manually reverse engineer them, break them apart, scan them, assess them, etc., which is a very time-consuming process. But
yeah, that sounds like work.
Yeah, exactly, and it doesn't scale either. And that's the problem. When you've got millions of apps, you have to do things at scale. And what that really boils down to is you have to use some kind of third-party automated assessment tool and use that tool to assess every application in your ecosystem for security and privacy problems, make an educated decision based on the results from that automated assessment, and then apply a policy or enforce that policy using some type of control point, mobile device control point, whether it be an MDM or a solution that has the ability to say apps can or can't stay and reside on the device. So whitelisting with an automated approach is by far the best way to go.
Agreed.
All right, thanks, guys. Let's move on to our next question. In your view, are CIOs aware of network threats like poison DNS and site spoofing? Dave, could you share your thoughts on this? And then I'm almost certain Tyler will have a few comments as well.
Well, yes, I think that we both talk to CIOs and different levels of employees in the security and IT community. I guess my view is that on the CIO level, they seem to be more concerned about operational issues, cost management, those types of things, staffing, and less educated on what the current threats are. So I find in my briefings with CIOs and even some chief security officers, it's an educational moment where they don't really know all those threats. Tyler, I'd love to hear what you're experiencing.
Yeah, no, every CIO that I speak to, they wouldn't know what these terms were in general. A chief security officer might, like you said, but the CIO would not. And to be honest with you, I don't think they should. I don't think that getting down to that tactical level would be the best use of their time as a CIO. I think they would be better served by relying on a senior engineer or a CSO to work with them and to deliver the technology or the intelligence around the technology and concepts to help them make more informed decisions. I see the CIO's role drastically changing in the next 5 years. I see the CIO becoming a lot more of a vendor manager than a traditional CIO. As consumerization, BYOD, and cloud services really start to take over the enterprise, it's really going to be the CIO's role to manage these vendors more so than it's going to be actually looking at the individual technologies and protocols. I think they're going to have their hands full just with that transformation alone.
I have a question. What do you think about advanced persistent threats and sort of these more very targeted attacks that we're seeing against companies of all types? Is that a CIO problem or a CSO problem or a mid-level IT security problem?
The targeted attack models are absolutely CIO's problem. It's a CSO's problem, but it's also a technologist's problem.
Okay.
I think it takes all 3 tiers to actually affect change in that. That's a very difficult problem to solve. Targeted attacks When I was doing actual assessments and penetration work for well over a decade, we had a well into the upper 90% success rate when we were targeted. There was always a way in, and it was just a matter of, kind of which way would it be? Would it be a spearfish? Would it be a social engineering attack? Would it be a direct network attack or an app layer attack? There was always a way in, and it was just a matter of time. The right way to approach that is to approach all the layers with all the levels of proficiency, everything from your deep technical guys looking at the problem all the way up through the CIO looking at it from a vendor management and from an outsourcing standpoint, and making sure that the correct people are on the game.
At this time, I'd like to remind everyone to please feel free and send Tyler and Dave any questions you may have by typing them in the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. All right, let's go ahead and move on to question number 5. Most advanced persistent threats begin with phishing, spear phishing, or SMS phishing attacks. What is the best way to protect enterprise mobile users from these types of attacks? Dave, as chair of the Anti-Phishing Working Group, you must have a few strong opinions on this subject.
Yeah, I do. I think that in addition to what Tyler was talking about, there are some other things that need to be looked at. So one of them is end user training, for example. We're finding that, while again, nowhere near 100% effective, training users that there are attacks against them, there are spear phishing attacks, there are dangers to using random networks, so that's important. I think particularly on the spear phishing and SMS phishing attacks, which are where we're seeing the targeted things happen against very targeted users, there's a few things that can be done there. So one is make sure that users are routed through some form of network security on their mobile device, no matter what system they're on. So for example, a VPN service that offers blacklisting, that offers analysis of what sites they visit or what sites apps visit. Is the ASN of the network that traffic is coming from that user's device owned by, for example, a known criminal group, the Russian Business Network, or the Syrian Electronic Army? Those are all things that can and should be done for mobile users, even if they're connecting in through a Starbucks, for example. I'm also a big fan of email authentication and using DMARC to at least stop targeted attacks from hitting users where it pretends to be your own IT staff. There's no reason, in my opinion, why somebody should send email to your company pretending to be from your company and not come from your own mail servers. Tyler, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it spot on. I think it's a holistic approach. One question actually I'd like to throw right back to you, Dave, is security awareness and education being a non-scalable solution going to ever solve the problem, or do we really have to focus on the technology aspects and some kind of transparent security to be layered on top of that education, right?
Yeah, we absolutely have to do both. What I've seen in education is that you can have, for example, let's say a CIO, and I've worked with a number of them, decides that we're going to do a security test where we will phish our own employees once a year. And if they click on that, then we will take them to an educational moment saying, hey, you shouldn't have clicked on that. What we found is that can reduce response rates from, for example, 40% down to 17%. That still means 17% of users are going to fall for, the type of attack that wasn't even created by somebody who's super malicious yet. So absolutely having a layered security model of transparent technologies, network solutions, dynamic learning systems that work on mobile as well as on PCs is crucial. But let's face it, no solution's 100%, and combining that with some user education is important. The other thing I found is that when companies are targeted with an APT, almost always it involves a phishing or spear phishing, And a lot of times those are self-reported. The bad news is sometimes if people don't realize it, then, or they don't admit it, then the only way we find it is, after the data is gone, and then you do a forensic analysis. So I do think they go hand in hand.
All right, thanks, guys. Let's go ahead and move on to question number 6. What do you see as the relationship between security and risk in a BYOD environment? This is a great thought-provoking question, and Tyler, I think well-suited for you.
Yeah, security and risk in a BYOD environment, it's largely they go hand in hand. When you're bringing in mobile devices, there's a fine line that an enterprise has to dance between over control or too much control of the user's device and too little security, and that fine line is defined by using the risk tolerance level of the enterprise in question. So the good news is that we can actually start to create models around this and look and say, given the level of risk tolerance we have as an enterprise, where do we fall on that continuum between overly secure and under security or making things too loose? That's the good news. The bad news is that defining your risk tolerance level is a very difficult exercise in and of itself. There's a lot of variables really to weigh there. So as BYOD continues to overtake the enterprise, we're really going to have to start to manage that well. This is something that you have to do as an enterprise by segmenting your user base, because you may have separate risk tolerance levels at separate sections of your user base, and actually doing full segmentation exercise, BYOD policy creation on a per segment basis, and then looking at how that reduces the risk of the particular BYOD threat that you're considering. So it's a balancing act. It's certainly going to have to be a defense in depth type thing, as we've mentioned a couple times on this call already. It's a type of thing where you're going to have to couple education with network layer, with application layer, with encryption security, detection, anomaly detection security, all the different layers, and kind of put those together to wrap that problem all at once.
Thank you, Tyler. This next question is actually a natural follow-on to our last question, so I'll ask you to take this one as well. How do you see security policy evolving from addressing static access control to addressing risk-based access control?
Yeah, so static access control is kind of like the baby crawling. They can get around. It's semi-functional, but at the end of the day, that baby wants to get up and walk and be a full-grown adult. And I think that's the difference between static access control. If I were to make an analogy, that's the analogy I'd make between static access control and risk-based access control. Static access control is just immature, harder to manage, more difficult to scale. It's a reasonable problem. We've been using static access control for many, many years now, and we've been using it semi-effectively. You still have to rely upon some basic authentication components for that to happen. So depending on how your authentication is working, whether you're using two-factor or not, could also play directly into the success of a static access control mechanism. But risk-based access control, where we can actually apply and quantify risk metrics to something, really gives us that next step. So take, for example, two documents sitting on your mobile device, where one document is, well, better yet, sitting in a folder that you can access from your mobile device, where one document is the secret plans for creating the Death Star that you and your team are making inside of your all-day meeting that you're in. And the other document that's in there is your lunch schedule for the meeting, all the food that everybody ordered for lunch. Those two documents have completely different risk profiles. And if we can actually create access control based on things like what the document is, what it contains, its sensitivity level, who's allowed to access it, what types of people are accessing it, and create a risk profile value, and then create a threshold, that's a much more advanced way of applying security to your data directly. And I think that's the future of access control over time.
Thank you, Tyler.
Let me give you another, Paul and Tyler, let me give you another example of what we think it's moving to, which is a user who's got, for example, a lockdown device where there's only 10 apps on it. The passwords are different for every app. There's a strong password on the device. They're unable to load any other apps on it. It's up to the latest patch level of, for example, iOS or Android. It's got full disk encryption turned on. That user has a much lower risk profile than the user who shows up to use corporate networks or access those two different files that Tyler's talking about, who has an old version of the operating system, has 90 different apps that they downloaded from who knows where that are publishing the corporate address book out into the network onto some cloud service that might be scanning for documents on the device. They're running on some strange version of hardware. They're not up to date. That user has a lot more risk. So I think tying in risk around content analysis is important, as is looking at device risk, app behavioral risk, and also, for example, let's say that user has been visiting websites that, or has apps that are sending traffic to places that are known to have malicious content or be controlled by malicious entities, much higher risk. And a risk-based authentication system needs to span not just access of that user to your corporate information, but access by that user to cloud-based services that you use in your day-to-day business.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for extending that analogy even further. That is a perfect way to look at it. You can create those risk values and risk quotients off of tons of information, and the more information you bring in, the more accurate your response and your security levels can be.
Thank you, Dave.
Yep.
Thank you, Tyler. Gentlemen, in your estimation, do MDM solutions adequately protect the enterprise against dynamic mobile risks in a BYOD environment? It sounds like a loaded question. Tyler, why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts on this, and then I'd like Dave to comment as well.
Absolutely. So my answer to this is it depends on how you define MDM. If you define MDM as mobile device management, which most people do, in the traditional sense of managing the device, I would absolutely say it does not adequately protect the enterprise against dynamic mobile risks in a BYOD environment. If you start to expand on MDM and look at MDM as kind of the core technology in a larger security platform play, then you start to actually get some good security components and good security technologies and concepts involved that can actually be effective against dynamic mobile risks. So in the traditional sense, MDM does not protect the enterprise in that capacity.
I'd agree with that. I think that that MDM is an important foundation, and some MDM systems have 297 features, and you probably only need about 5 or 7 of those features, and then having a dynamic environment that lays on top of it, that cooperates with it, that can do more of the real risk-based analysis around what's happening in that BYOD environment is really the way forward. It's just as we've seen in everything in enterprise security, layered approaches, learning approaches, and increasingly big data approaches that allow you to detect what those risks are.
Absolutely. Extending the MDM into a security platform is absolutely the right solution there.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on to question 9. What is the best way to control mobile app and cloud-based app access to enterprise data from mobile devices? There are no easy questions in this deck. Dave, could you give us your opinion on this? And Tyler, if you have any comments, please feel free to interject.
So the way that I think about this is to take all that we've talked about around device management, risk assessment of apps and networks and behaviors, and realize that the perimeter of the enterprise is not just the network. We all know that now. It's also the endpoint, so it's the mobile user, the person working from home, the person on their phone. But the problem's gotten even bigger, which is, of course, there's all these cloud services that people are using now. And that's only going to increase in almost every single market out there, including the government. That is happening. And so you've got to be able to lock access down using the same risk-based profile management, risk-based analysis for those. My approach on that is to utilize single sign-on technologies that are integrated into the mobile security platform so that if a user's device or behavior or what have you, network access violates certain risk parameters, they're locked out from the cloud services, as well as locked out from accessing your corporate data until they fix whatever that problem is or that risk is. And those technologies tend to be single sign-on through SAML. That's starting to grow. You can do it to a lot of major platforms. You can't do it to everything yet, but you can do it to thousands of different cloud services, and your mobile security platform should have that capability.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that one, Paul. I think he's spot on. It's you know, I'm a very big proponent of securing at the data. So wherever the data goes, you have to secure, and that directly comes into play with mobile apps, cloud-based app access. It's kind of all in one fell swoop. And then if you apply risk-based assessment so that you're putting the appropriate quantity of security into each of those environments and locations, that's much more accurate than running a non-risk-based model where you just say, hey, you know, I want cloud provider X to provide me a pen test attestation document, and just calling it a day. Figure out ways to secure the data itself and apply the appropriate level of security based on true risk ratings is the way to go.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Dave. Gentlemen, this is our last question. Dave, why don't you go ahead and take the first shot at it, and then we'll give Tyler the final word. How should a company create risk-based access control system for corporate data, networks, and cloud services?
Well, I think first is to take a look at the risks and the threats versus the economic plan for your IT department and for your company. And the economic plan in many companies is moving to more cloud-based services and allowing people to do work wherever they are, whenever they are, on multiple different devices, including mobile platforms. So looking at that and going, well, what type of work's going to be done? Who's accessing which system? Where's it coming from? And then another economic factor that needs to be brought in here is, am I going to do a bring your own device program? And more and more companies are saying yes, and that means bringing in a mobile device, letting people use their mobile devices. Tyler had mentioned something which I'm in a strong agreement with, which is segmenting your user base and looking at their risk profiles and the type of work. Excuse me. A good example of that would be, for example, a clerical worker who needs to access maybe a payroll system, and they want to, it's a web-based system, they want to get to it from home and on their Android or what have you. That person has a very different risk profile from the sysadministrator who can access core internal systems, change passwords, has root privileges. So one example you might think of is, well, that clerical person can access the system from anywhere in the world. That's fine, as long as they have good authentication and their device is clean. But for the IT sysadmin, you might want to put in some additional dynamic rules which say things like, you can only access the IT systems from certain geolocation areas. Or if you travel more than 500 miles in 1 hour, that clearly means your account's been taken over because no one can travel that fast. Therefore, we're going to block your access. So thinking about risk and what kind of controls you need, I think are important as you dive into this endeavor.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. Again, you know, traditionally risk-based access controls have been manual in nature. You know, people sitting around a table actually doing threat analysis and attempting to quantify what risks were what, and then trying to map dollar signs to those risks and applying the appropriate level of resources to secure against those risks. And I think automated tools that are in place today really make that a viable option when you can actually look at behaviors, look at anomalies, look at the data as it's going across the wire or in the air. As Dave mentioned, look at locations, IP geolocations of logins, things like that. You can actually create quite a wealth of knowledge around acceptable behavior, what is normal, I guess is the way I should put it, and you can actually quantify with fairly good accuracy when things aren't right. And I think the better we get at automating that, the better these types of solutions will be. So in the meantime, continue to do it, continue to do it. Whether it's manual or using automated tools, you have to do it to be the most effective that you can be as a security organization.
All right. Well, thank you for the wonderful insight, gentlemen. We have several great questions from our audience today. So at this time, I'd like to open up our Q&A session.
So, folks, if you want to ask questions, just type them in on the questions panel, and we will take them. I'll take the first one, which is what are the differences between the Android and the iOS platform for malicious apps? My view on that one is that core at the center of security models, both Android and iPhone are similarly secure. There are some differences. However, what we're seeing in the real world is that because Android is an open platform, there's just been a lot of fragmentation around the platform. There are over 3,500 different versions of Android on different platforms. And each version, it might be an older version at a different patch level, and it also may have different security settings or different bundled apps that come with it. So it creates an extremely diverse threat environment to defend against. Whereas on iPhone, it tends to be a lot more concentrated around the last 2 or 3 versions, and there's only one real platform. Your real worry is it jailbroken or not? So we have been seeing more malicious apps on Android. However, we have been seeing ways that people are sneaking in apps into, for example, the App Store for iPhone. So there was a paper published about 2 weeks ago that showed that you basically dynamically change what your app's behavior is after it's been installed. So when Apple is evaluating it, it behaves well, but once a person's got it and downloaded it, then you use effectively botnet type controls to make it do evil things. So that those attacks are starting to come, and as we mentioned earlier in the call, there are a set of new attacks around hostile profiles and other that are emerging against the iOS platform. So Android definitely got its share of problems, probably much higher than we've seen on iOS, but iOS definitely has them as well.
Yep, seconded. Android's more dangerous, not because the operating system is necessarily more dangerous, but because it is fragmented, exactly as Dave mentioned. That, and there's absolutely a much higher rate of app decompilation and rewrapping occurring in the Android space. I believe that's probably largely to do with the fact that it's Java-based code as opposed to Objective-C-based code, which is a little bit more difficult to unsign, resign, etc. Specifically, the Android side, I would say, is more susceptible because by default you can change where you're getting your applications from. You don't have to go single source from the Google Marketplace. You can pull your apps from anywhere you want. Where iOS it's harder to do that without jailbreaking. So I think there's a more vibrant attack scenario, and I think there's a more vibrant attack community around application rewrappings, especially in Google in Eastern Europe and Asia. But other than that, I agree. Neither one's safe, just one is a little safer than the other.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think on the Windows mobile side of things, it's way too early to tell. The market share's not there, the penetration's not there, and the bad guys like to go where the users are. And so, they're definitely targeting the iOS and Android platforms more. I also think on the Windows side, we will, as it gains market share, we're going to see a lot of different threats and attacks, and the security technology on Windows Mobile is certainly nowhere near as advanced as on the other platforms. I mean, it's a brand new platform. There's another question here about scanning for the risk of malicious apps. And the question is whether it's best to scan on app stores or to scan apps that are on user devices? My view on that is kind of I think the real answer is neither. So I do think scanning app stores is interesting. It's a good source of seed data, and I know of over 100. However, there are people who claim there may be up to 500 different places where apps can get loaded onto devices. I think you can't scan them on the device because that just takes too much CPU power, burns too much battery, and you're back to sort of almost signature-based. So the approach that I recommend is to have a technology that scans the device, looks at the apps, but the actual analysis is done off the device at the security provider in the cloud, who can run it in a VM at high speed, do analysis, compare it to other samples, and then flag risky behavior.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. You wouldn't want to waste your precious resources at the handheld level to execute the assessments. You absolutely have to either push a hash or push the actual package itself up into the cloud for assessment. Obviously, once it's been assessed, you can actually compare that against, by just sending a hash, you can compare it against auto-assessed situations by providers. But in general, I would say that, yeah, you want to have it done off device. And it's not a bad thing for vendors to proactively search out and auto-download and auto-scan things from app stores. I think there's a lot of value in that, in so much as it works as a pre-caching mechanism for off-device scanning for the end consumer. So I think both are useful. It's just who's doing it and where they're doing it determines to what degree of usefulness you have.
There's one other value, I think, to scanning the app stores, and we haven't talked about it so much, but it's definitely a threat against an enterprise in a bigger picture, which are people posting apps that claim to be from your company. So let me give you a simple example. Somebody writes an app that says it's from the Bank of Awesomeness, and they post it on some app store that's not, for example, Google Play. They may spam out advertisements to it. It may be through search engines. It may be through reputation that people actually get, the Bank of Awesomeness's app, but it's really not from the Bank of Awesomeness. We've seen malicious apps being posted that way, and we have also seen innocent apps being posted that way, where it's, somebody's writing a helper app but names it as somebody's company. Those are things that can be proactively scanned for. So having a scanning technology that can look at app stores and look for your brand name, your company's name in there, can be an early warning, for example, that maybe somebody is out there writing either something to attack your customers or something where possibly one of your employees is going to download it thinking it's the newest VPN for your company. Well,
Dave,
we have about...
Do you have any more questions in there, Dave, by chance?
We've got about 1 minute for more questions, so if there's any other questions, we'll take them. All right, well, I think we've covered the important stuff.
Thank you very much, everybody. As a quick reminder, a recording of this webinar will be made available on our website. As always, please visit marbleSecurity.com for upcoming and on-demand webinars. I'd like to thank all of our audience participants, as well as Tyler and Dave, for joining us here today. This concludes Marble Security's webinar on defending against mobile attacks and data loss in the enterprise.